So let's start into the modeling. I started out in Fusion 360 just to get the rough shape of the felbeast to ensure that the dimensions were correct. The important part was that the back of the neck needed to have an 8-inch diameter approximately to fit in with the tube that will become the neck. So from there I built the basic shape of the jaws and then pulled this into Mesh Mixer to start the more organic sculpting. The sculpting tools in Mesh Mixer are actually really useful here. I found it quite easy to work with after I've tried this a couple of times now. So with a lot of patience just kind of building out different areas and just trying different things using some reference photos, I was able to get a shape that did start to look like the felbeast. Now of course this is without the armor and a lot of the reference images are with the armor, so I just used some artistic liberty there anywhere that there wasn't a good reference, and it made something that looked scary and resembled the felbeast. I made the jaws wide open because I want people to be able to stick their heads into the jaws to pose for a photo. So that had to be wide enough to fit someone's head. Again, that was another important dimension that I established previously. And then from there, I just made sure that the teeth and the tongue and everything weren't too big to take away that functionality. And the inside of the mouth does need to look cool because you will be able to see inside if you're the photo subject or just someone looking at the photo booth. Not so much in pictures other than kind of more the tongue area. But it still wasn't too much extra work just to sculpt the inside of that mouth to look awesome. I really made use of the Move tool for this, which I hadn't tried too much before, but I found that very useful for fine-tuning the overall kind of direction of different parts, moving the snout out a little more. It was a bit too snubbed off at first, and so I was able to make those changes without damaging the details that I had already started sculpting. I really only had to focus on one side of the head because it's going to be symmetrical along that central axis, but I did model kind of the whole thing as I went for at least a good bit of it, just because you need to be able to see it in context. It's a little bit harder to get the proportions right and whatnot if you're not looking at the entire head. Once I had the shape established and like the nostrils in there and eyes and whatnot, then I could really start getting more detailed with the sort of anatomy of the jawline and the skin around the mouth area, and also starting to add some texture. With the teeth, I first did some really rough kind of just general teeth-ish looking things, just put them in their own layers so I could turn it on and off, just to see again approximately what he looks like with teeth, because it is hard to tell if what you have is correct without the teeth. He just looks like a sock puppet basically before he's got the teeth in. Then afterwards I did go back in and do correct teeth, so we'll do that in a minute. But with all of that texture, I didn't put it over the entire thing because then it just sort of gets lost. But if you focus your texture more on the areas that are high or kind of towards the front there, it gives you that variation of small texture, large texture, and smoother areas. That will also help it to blend more into the body, which is going to be more of a smooth texture. I made the back of the mouth have plenty of space back there behind the tongue because I do want to set up lighting after this is fully created. So make sure to leave enough space for that, and also undercut the tongue here so that it looks like it's kind of standing out on its own but still has enough connection to print properly. I kept looking at this from different angles and trying different brushes, just doing some experimenting to find the best tools for each stage of this project. I did take the time to build each tooth socket just so it would have a realistic effect in there, because that was kind of an important feature area was the mouth, so it was worth spending the time to really get that right. And then I built out the gums a little bit in some areas so that you've got a variety of sizes of teeth and angles, and they do change the kind of appearance from the outside when you've got those kind of bigger teeth pressing the gums out further. The nostrils I had a little bit of trouble with for a while, just trying to figure out what type of nostril I wanted. You can't see the felbeast nostrils in most of the reference photos because they're covered by the armor, so I did kind of a mix of some images I think that's from the game, and then also just kind of reptilian type nostrils and whatnot, till I found something that just kind of looked right with the rest of the features. And I did make the eyes nice and deep in the sockets there because those are really going to be featured. We're going to be adding some LEDs behind those later on, so I wanted to make sure that those had plenty of detail and enough space for the light to shine through and really show up the three-dimensionality of that area. And as I'm working here, I'm being careful not to change the dimensions of the back of the neck area there, because I do need to make sure that that will meet up properly with the the ductwork that's going to be the neck back there. So it will kind of have a little bit of a sleeve around it to cover that area, but it still needs to be approximately the right size. And it also still needs to look proportional with the Fellbeast overall. So I'm doing these videos in segments, but I'm really developing the whole project as a whole as I go here. And for the texture, I kind of started putting it further down and then realized it looks best towards the top. And then just leave the throat nice and smooth and really focus on building out the areas that kind of have jaw muscles and then leave other areas more flat. So you'll see I keep turning on the teeth there just to, again, just double check that what I'm doing looks right with something that's standing in for the teeth. And then once I've got that to where I like it with the whole head there, I can go ahead and just cut it in half, keep the half that I like best and that I was working on most, and then we'll mirror that in a moment. Now for the teeth, I just kind of pulled up some blobs there and made each tooth unique, so each one was sculpted by itself just to give it a really organic and kind of gnarly sort of toothy kind of grin going on there. Really imperfect, like maybe he's had some teeth ripped out or just kind of his teeth just all grow differently. While I'm sculpting these teeth, I am keeping in mind what's going to print. You don't want anything that's too small. You got to keep in mind the orientation that this will be printed and make sure that you create shapes that are going to show up well in the medium for which they're created. Unfortunately, I can't just mirror the bottom teeth to the top, so I had to sculpt for half of the head, both the top and bottom teeth, and each one of those is a layer at first just so I can move them around separately, and then I just kind of joined them together later on so they'd be a little bit easier to work with. The top teeth, I made them just a little bit smaller. That's kind of what I was seeing in the reference photos, and it seemed to work pretty well just to have it nice and kind of small teeth towards the front at the top, and then kind of larger, slightly wider spaced teeth towards the bottom. I also kind of changed the shape of the teeth a little bit in some areas because for the most part they came out kind of rounded just with the tools that I was using and starting with a sphere as the base. So some of them I kind of flattened out, especially those larger ones, to give them less of a rounded, commercially made tooth shape and more of an organic, natural tooth shape. With this file, of course you want to do the larger shapes first and then work towards details. And as I'm getting into all these fine details with the teeth, the file was definitely starting to slow my computer down. That's a lot of vertices on there, a lot of triangulations. So every so often I would go through and just kind of reduce areas that had more detail than they needed. So just to try to keep that file more manageable, but it still was getting pretty slow while doing these details on the gums around each tooth. So I did just build up the gum a little bit at the base of each tooth so it would look like it was growing out of a socket even more, and sort of just pushed in some of the edge there to create a gum line from the outside also. It's definitely kind of tedious work doing all these fine details, but I really focused on details that I knew would show up and didn't waste time on anything that was too fine of a detail to be seen at the scale that this piece is being created. And since the jaws are a feature point, again, like the eyes, that's a good area to spend more time revising the details and just don't worry about doing super fine details in areas that it's not really going to show up. At the center line there's going to be a little bit of a kind of repeat of the teeth there where they look like they've been mirrored, so that'll just need to be tweaked a little bit to make it look like a single head, not a head cut in half and then stuck together. But overall everything mirrors just fine, so there's not a whole lot of work to do after you do that slicing and then mirroring. Just position it so that they touch, and then any little areas that don't quite make sense with the slice, just fix those up, and he is ready to be cut into smaller pieces for printing. Now, this is a very, very large model. I didn't even really fully comprehend the scale until I started printing it and started trying to cut this into pieces that would fit on the printer. It ended up being quite a few more pieces than I had expected. It was 13 pieces to get it all to print on the Ultimaker, and it was a little bit of a kind of a decision process to decide what orientation to use for each piece. I did find that for the teeth, they needed to be printed with the teeth facing upwards, so I sliced it in a way that was possible. I tried printing one on end just to see if they might bridge well, and it didn't bridge well with the filament I was using, so I just stuck with laying it flat on the bed, printing the teeth from the bed up, and they came out really well with minimal cleanup. The infill, I ended up having to do 12% for the filament that I'm using. This is Cheetah. I wanted to use a flexible filament for the teeth just so that nothing would be too sharp in that area. And then the top and bottom pieces are made from Tech G. The top needed to be translucent specifically because we're going to be doing LEDs behind the eyes, so obviously if you've got cheetah for the whole thing, you're not going to be able to see those lights. You would have to cut the eyes out and do something different. So I've glued together the top and bottom sections for the fell beast using some Gorilla Glue because these are Tech-G and I find that the Gorilla Glue works just fine. So for the cheetah portions, I used a more flexible glue. This is a gasket adhesive. This is the first time I've tried it and it seems to work quite well. And also because I'm going to be filling the cracks with the 3D pen using the same material, that does reinforce it a lot after the gluing stage. So really the glue kind of keeps it in place until you can actually melt it together also. And I did this sanding in stages. Some of the pieces I cleaned up first and then glued them together just because as you start to attach these pieces, accessibility gets more and more limited, especially areas such as the back of the tongue. Once that's glued together, you're not going to be able to do anything like with sanding in that area. So really think about accessibility before you glue something together. And then there's still going to be some areas that you just can't quite get to, but that means they're probably also not going to be super visible, so it's not a big deal. Now once the glue is dry there, you can start pumping in some of the filament. I like to press it down with my finger when it's just cool enough to touch, and that really makes that seam nice and strong, pushes the filament into the cracks, and then you can just sand that down. And a couple of my teeth didn't come out great for whatever reason, so I just kind of reformed those with the 3D pen again. That's become my absolute favorite tool for finishing any sort of 3D print. It makes the process fast, it makes a really sturdy kind of weld, and saves a lot of trouble of trying to do it with a wood burner or anything like that, because it is, you know, pumping the material in. I don't have to be holding material in one hand and the soldering iron in the other. And I was wearing a penguin hat for a lot of this process because it was really cold outside, so if you see a beak peeking into the frame, sorry about that. It was quite a process even just attaching all of these pieces because it was just so many parts, and you know, you gotta make sure each piece is properly repaired so it does look seamless in the end. I didn't worry about sanding areas that were nicely printed, you know, they're nice and smooth, just very fine sand lines, because it's more detailed than it really matters in a piece at this scale. So I focused on any areas that didn't come out quite right and sanded those nice and smooth and filled as needed too in a little bit here. But before gluing the top piece on, obviously we've got to go ahead and get those LEDs inside because there's no access once it's glued together. So I kind of just drilled out a trench behind the eyes and cleared out as much material as I could right behind the eyes. I also did drill a hole right behind the tongue because we will need an access hole for wiring some red LEDs for the mouth. Into that trench I glued some aluminum foil to block off areas where I don't want the light to go, because I want to just kind of focus and reflect as much light as possible towards the eyeballs. As I glued in the foil, I did just shine in a flashlight to check and see how well I was doing with directing the light where I wanted it to go. Once I was happy with that, I actually wired together the LEDs and put them in to the back of the head there. But of course they need to be tested before you start doing something like this. Make sure that your joint was good and that your lights are going to be nice and sturdy and not stop working at some point, because once this is glued together there's no getting back to these LEDs. They're either going to work or they're not, so just keep testing as you go to make sure nothing's screwed up and that your lights are going to be nice and bright. I just blocked off the rest of the LEDs with a little more foil just to close that in, and then I was able to go ahead and glue those pieces together just with running the cord back through another trench there. I'm bringing all the cords to the lower back of the head because I did print that piece hollow, so it's just a nice place to have both of my cables from the mouth and from the eyes run to, and then I can just pull them out the back and they'll eventually run up through the neck to get power. For the mouth, I've got a strip of red LEDs. I'm just wiring on a cable here, and I'm not going to cut the length of this quite yet because I don't really know how much light I want in the mouth. It's a little hard to tell before it's put together, so I just left the strand long, made sure that there was a good clear hole there, and then that I can run through later on. The eyes, though, obviously it has to be completely set up before you glue anything together, so I ran that through all of the pieces that were in the way just to get down to the very bottom piece at the back where it's hollow, and I can just kind of leave the cord till I'm ready for it. There's that hollow piece, just putting my cords inside. I'm not even drilling a hole just yet. I'll drill a hole once I have everything kind of fully repaired and ready to go. For the seams between the Tech-G and the cheetah, I just used cheetah to fill it in. You could really use either one. They have a similar temperature, they bond together just fine, so there's no concern there with using the two different types of filament. And that's everything filled and sanded as much as I can tell at this point. It's a little bit hard to tell if you've missed spots before it's kind of been primed at least. At the very back there, and also some under the tongue, there were some areas I couldn't reach to fill. So I used some liquid nails and just smeared that in as smoothly as I could with a glove, and that was good enough. Those areas don't really show a whole lot anyway, so it's no big deal, but I just would prefer not to have any cracks back there, even if you can't see them too much. And then I went and just put on a coat of filler primer over this. Now, I'm not doing it really super thick or anything. I just want to make sure that I can see any areas that need a little bit of further repair and fix those before moving on to the painting stage. Before painting though, we do need to attach the brackets that will attach to the neck and suspend this head, because if you're trying to do this after you've already painted it, you risk damaging your finish. So it's better to do all of these sort of intense kind of attaching things before you do any sort of finish work. So I cut some strips of PVC. This is 1-inch PVC, and I cut 5-inch pieces of it, and then I've just heated those and flattened them out and then flipped up a little edge there. This is just to make a bracket, and I'm going to use 2 for each bracket. There's going to be 2 pipes holding this up. So I've made 2 sets of 2 brackets, and then I am welding those on with the plastic welder. I mean, you could use a soldering iron too. This gets nice and hot, has a nice wide flat tip for getting that all welded on properly. And you got to mix the 2 materials together, with the PVC mixing into the filament. I just used scrap filament for putting on more material with that. So do make sure that it's really, really sturdy, because that entire weight of the head is going to be supported on those brackets. So it needs to be strong and not something that's going to peel up after it's stuck on there for a while. So make sure that you mix the materials in properly and attach them really, really, really well. Now you can move on to painting. So we're going to start with a base coat of black, just like all the parts for this. And then I am going to mist on some of that medium gray color. Obviously, you don't need to worry about covering every bit of the black, because we're really just building up some layers here anyways, and we're going to be adding in more shadows. Next, do some highlights with the sand color, and go a little more light on that. We don't want it to be too brown. Basically, with all of the parts of the fell piece, just make sure that you pick a consistent color style, because the pieces do all need to look cohesive in the end. In the mouth, I used the flat red primer and put on a nice thick layer there so that it's nice and red, although it does dry a lot more rusty. It looks really bright when you first put it on. And then I've built up some more shadows using the dark gray primer and going back in with some black here and there, and just kind of building up the layers until the shadows and highlights and everything make sense and look cohesive and nice and well blended. It's definitely a lot of back and forth with this piece, because first I made it a little too light, then a little too dark. You know, you don't want to lose your highlights or your shadows. But with a rattle can like that, you know, you only have so much control with how much is coming out. But I made it work. For the mouth, I kind of tried to keep the red inside, but it does get a little bit messy, so I had to touch that up around the jaw. And don't worry about the teeth right now, because we're going to paint those with a brush later on. I've used the flat red to do just some light misting all over, just kind of to tie in the red color, and same thing as we did with the wing, and we're going to do with the body. It's just to make it all look cohesive, and it does kind of give it a little bit of added dimension to have that extra color thrown in there. If anywhere gets too dark or too light, you know, just go back with the previous color, the lighter color or darker color. Once it dries, it looks pretty cool. It's all flat, so it doesn't have that shine that it has when you first start painting it. So I think that's a nicer finish for this particular beast. For the teeth, I used some cream color along with some of the stone gray that we're going to be using on the backdrop, and I just sprayed some of that into a lid and added a little bit of paint thinner to make kind of more of a wash, and started brushing that on over the teeth. Again, we're building up some layers, so don't fully cover your dark layer underneath. Just brush it on, leave some bits showing, and then go back in with a little bit of a thicker version, not quite as much paint thinner, to do some of those more intense highlights on the teeth. And then we'll of course have to add some shadows too. So while adding the shadows, I'm going to make the gums a little more red, mix in some of the reds, some of the blacks, start to kind of establish a little bit more variation in those gums, because they're kind of flat looking right now. I've mixed together black and flat red to start adding some shadows into the gums, and I want to blend that up onto the teeth a little bit, because you don't want these looking all perfect like pearly whites. They need to look a little bit grungy, because he's not brushing, you can be pretty sure of that. the gums are the transition point between the red mouth and then the gray on the outside, so just kind of add some of the black, some of the red, and sort of make it a little bit mottled in that area so that it does transition to the outside coloring. And then around the eye, I've made it a little bit more red and also just a little bit darker. Same in the nostrils, darken those up a little bit so they stand out a little more with that shadowing. On the inside of the eyelids, I did paint some bright silver color just to help it reflect the light a little bit more once these LEDs are turned on. And it also kind of just set the eyes off a little bit, that tiny rim of silver that you can see from the outside. Now that the painting's done, I'm going to pull those wires out through the back of the fell beast and add the red ones also. So I've got that pre-drilled hole back there, and it was a little bit hard to make the hole in the cheetah, so I kind of propped it open by pushing a straw through, so it was okay getting the cords through, not too bad. And then they just go down into that hollow piece at the back, and I just drilled the hole big enough till I could reach in and pull both of those cords out, because we're going to wire them together and then add a power source so that this can be powered up later on once it's all installed. I just kind of roughly trimmed the red LEDs because I don't know how long they need to be just yet at that point. So now I've got a connector that you can disconnect at the back of the head here because we want to be installing this head separately, not trying to put the head and the neck all up together. So we'll be able to run the cord through the neck and then plug in the head later on. And then of course we've got just a power connector here to plug into a standard power outlet. Now we're going to do the eyes. So for this I want them to glow a little bit more blue. So I've got some clear caulking and I'm thinning that down with some mineral spirits and adding a little bit of watercolor to it to give it a nice dark blue tinge. And the watercolor will stay translucent in that clear caulk, so it'll just shine right through and make them look kind of cool and interesting and creepy. So I used a palette knife to smooth it on, and you do have to work pretty fast with this because once the caulk starts drying too much, you can add as much mineral spirits as you want and it will just not do anything. So mix it up into a nice paste that you can work with, smooth it on, and then you can take a little more mineral spirits at the end, kind of smooth out the top layer a little bit. And now the head is ready to go. So with the red lights, I ended up using some blue tack to stick them in place. Since this is a photo booth, you know, we're staging this to look good from a certain angle. So in that case, it's not important that you can see the LEDs from the front because you're not going to see it that way in a picture. So from this far side here, the LEDs just look really cool. And that was the best way to get the light right exactly where I wanted it to show up in the pictures.